They told you the dome on the old Capitol building was a symbol, a crown of democracy, a flourish of marble and gilt meant to inspire the citizen walking up the steps below. But symbols do not need copper sheathing tuned to a precise thickness. Symbols do not need a central spindle of iron running from the lantern at the very top, down through the rotunda and into a grounded well beneath the foundation. Symbols do not hum. And the men who built these domes, in the decades before anyone alive today was born, left behind drawings that do not describe ornament at all. They describe a receiver. They describe a machine for catching something out of the air, something the public was never told existed. And the strangest part of the whole story is not that these structures were built this way. The strangest part is that at a certain point, all across the country, within the span of a single generation, someone went up to the top of each one and quietly cut the antenna away. Now let us begin where the official story begins, because you have to understand what you were told before you can see what you were not. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. The standard account is simple and reassuring. The great civic domes of the 1800s, the ones that sit atop state capitals and old custom houses, and the grandest of the railway terminals, were built as expressions of confidence. A young and growing nation wanted to look permanent. It wanted to borrow the visual language of Rome and Florence, the language of empires that had lasted, and so it raised these enormous curved roofs of iron and copper and crowned them with lanterns and finials. The dome in this telling is pure rhetoric. It says we are here, we are serious, we will endure. And that is a perfectly satisfying explanation, right up until you start reading the construction ledgers. Because the ledgers do not read like the bills for a decoration. They read like the bills for an apparatus. Consider the material itself. A dome built only to be seen needs a skin that looks good and keeps the rain out. Ordinary sheet copper, nailed down, painted, or left to weather into that familiar green, would do the job for a fraction of the cost. But again and again, in building after building, the specifications call for copper of a particular gauge, rolled to a tolerance far tighter than weatherproofing would ever require, and laid over a continuous framework of iron ribs that are themselves bonded together with a care that has nothing to do with holding up a roof. The whole shell, skin and skeleton together, is made electrically continuous. Every plate touches the next. Every rib connects to the central mast. In the language of the men who actually understand such things, what you have described is not a roof. It is a single enormous conductive surface. It is, whether the architects of record admitted it or not, an aerial. And the size of it matters. A small wire strung between two poles can catch a faint signal. A surface measured in thousands of square feet, lifted high above every other structure in the city, electrically whole from edge to edge, would catch a great deal more than a faint signal. It would gather, it would concentrate, it would take whatever was moving through the air above the rooftops and funnel it down to a single point, the way a great curved lens gathers scattered light and brings it to a focus. Nobody builds a lens by accident. And nobody, looking honestly at these specifications, can quite believe that a surface this carefully made was meant only to be looked at. And an aerial is only half of the machine. An aerial needs a path to the ground. And here the old drawings become genuinely difficult to explain away. Running down from the lantern at the dome's peak, the small glazed structure that everyone assumes is just there to let in light. There is, in case after case, a heavy central rod. It is described in some documents as a lightning conductor, and that is the explanation that has been handed down, that these rods were simply early lightning protection. But lightning protection of that era was a thin cable or a slender point, cheap and replaceable, run down the outside of a building where it could be inspected. What the drawings show instead is a thick iron spindle, sometimes as wide across as a man's arm, run down the very centre of the structure, insulated from the masonry around it, descending past the rotunda floor and into a deep shaft, and at the bottom of that shaft a chamber, a well, often filled with water or with a bed of charcoal and metal filings, or with both. That is not how you stop lightning. That is how you give a faint electrical signal somewhere to go. That is a ground in the technical sense, the deliberate engineered connection between an aerial high in the air and the deep, stable body of the earth. Put the two halves together and the shape of the thing becomes hard to unsee. A vast conductive dome at the top, a central conductor running down the middle, a grounding chamber at the bottom. That is the basic anatomy of a receiver, the same anatomy scaled up enormously that you would find in the earliest experiments with wireless signals, and the dates line up in a way that should make anyone pause. These domes were being designed and raised in exactly the decades when a handful of brilliant and now half-forgotten experimenters were demonstrating that energy and information could be drawn out of the air itself, that the Earth and the atmosphere together formed a kind of vast circuit, and that a properly tuned structure could tap into it. We remember a few of their names. We have quietly forgotten most of them. And we have forgotten almost entirely the brief, strange window in which their ideas were not fringe at all, but were taken seriously enough that they may have shaped the very buildings in which the business of the nation was conducted. This is where the niche we are exploring tonight, the revisionist reading of economic history, becomes essential, because you cannot understand why something like this would be built and then dismantled unless you follow the money and the power around it. Ask yourself a simple question. Who paid for these domes? No, not the abstract answer, the public, the taxpayer. Who actually moved the money? Who sat on the building commissions? Who held the contracts for the copper and the iron and the specialized labor? When you trace those threads, you find the same small circle of names again and again. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The men who controlled the banks, the men who controlled the new networks of wire and rail that were knitting the country together. The men, in short, who stood to gain the most from controlling how energy and information flowed, and to lose the most if either of those things became free. These were not careless men. They did not spend without reason, and they did not fund beauty for its own sake. Everything they touched because it returned something to them, in money or in leverage, or in the slow, quiet accumulation of control over the systems other people depended on. So when you see their fingerprints on the contracts for a strange and expensive dome, the honest question is not whether they were sentimental. The honest question is what they expected that dome to do, and that is the heart of it. Imagine for a moment that the early claims were not entirely wrong. Imagine that a large, well-grounded, well-tuned structure really could draw up a usable trickle of energy from the atmosphere, or could receive signals sent through the earth without any wire connecting sender to receiver. Now imagine you are a man whose entire fortune is built on the wire, on the meter, on the idea that energy and information are things you sell by the unit to people who have no other way of getting them. A working dome is not a marvel to you. A working dome is a threat. It is the proof of concept for a world in which your meter is worthless. And the most rational thing for such a man to do, faced with that threat, is not to destroy the buildings which are beautiful and useful and good for public confidence, but simply to reach up to the top of each one and quietly remove the single component that makes it more than a roof. Cut the antenna. Leave the dome. It is, when you think about it, the perfect crime, because nothing is missing that anyone would notice, and what is missing was never officially there to begin with. Listen to how neatly that explains the physical evidence that survives, because the evidence does survive in maintenance records and restoration reports that almost nobody reads. Over and over, when these old domes are opened up for repair, the workers find that the central mast has been severed, not corroded, not failed, but cut cleanly, often at the level of the lantern where the work could be done discreetly from inside. They find grounding chambers that have been filled in with rubble or simply sealed and forgotten, their purpose erased from the institutional memory. They find the heavy original cabling replaced where it was replaced at all, with thin modern wire that serves only as lightning protection, the real explanation quietly retrofitted onto a structure that was never built for that purpose. And here is the small detail that lingers longest. In more than one of these reports, the men doing the repair note, almost in passing, that the cut surfaces of the old mast were clean and bright when they reached them, the way freshly worked iron looks, not the dull pitted grey you would expect from a break left. Exposed for decades, someone had sealed those cuts. Someone had wanted the sievering to last and to remain quiet, and to be found only by a stranger generations later who would have no idea what he was looking at. The dome that remains is genuine. The story attached to it is the patch. And the timing of all this cutting is the detail that keeps me up at night. It does not happen randomly across the centuries. It clusters. It clusters in the years when the great consolidations were happening, when the loose, competitive, chaotic early world of independent inventors and local power companies and small banks was being pulled together into a few enormous centralized systems. The same decades that gave us the unified national banking arrangements, the great mergers of the electrical companies, the standardization of the grid into something owned and metered and controlled from the top. It is as if, as the new order locked into place, someone went down a list, building by building, city by city, and made sure that every structure capable of operating outside that order was quietly switched off. The domes were not demolished. Demolition leaves a hole, and a hole invites questions. The antennas were simply cut, and the buildings were left standing as monuments to the very thing they had been prevented from doing. Now I want to be honest with you, because the worst thing this channel could ever do is hand you a tidy answer and pretend the case is closed. There are perfectly ordinary explanations for almost every individual piece of this. The tight copper tolerances might reflect nothing more than the pride and over-engineering of an age that built things to last. The central masts really were, in many cases, lightning conductors, and a thick one is simply a confident one. The grounding chambers may have been drainage, or the footings of the construction cranes, repurposed and forgotten. And the severing of the old masts may be nothing more sinister than the slow churn of maintenance, old systems removed because newer, cheaper protection had made them redundant. Taken one at a time, each anomaly dissolves into the ordinary. That is exactly what makes this so hard, and exactly why it has never become a scandal. No single thread pulled on its own leads anywhere alarming. But history is not made of single threads. It is made of patterns, of the way separate facts lean towards each other across the gaps, and the pattern here is uncomfortably consistent. The same unusual construction in building after building, the same anatomy of aerial, conductor and ground, the same small circle of financiers and industrialists standing behind the contracts, the same clustering of the cuts in the same narrow window of consolidation. You can dismiss any one of those. It is much harder to dismiss all of them at once, arranged in the same direction, pointing at the same quiet possibility. That somebody a very long time ago understood that the way energy and information move through a society is the way power itself moves through it, and that whoever controls those flows controls everything downstream of them, and that the cheapest, quietest way to win that control forever was not to fight in the open, but to climb to the top of every great building in the land and one by one, with no announcement and no record, cut the antennas away. So the next time you stand at the base of one of these old domes and tilt your head back to look up at it, do not just see the marble and the gilt and the confident curve against the sky. Look at the lantern at the very top and ask yourself what used to rise from it. Ask why the records are so vague about a structure that was documented down to the last rivet everywhere else. Ask who benefited from the silence. The dome is still there, patient and beautiful and switched off, keeping a secret in plain sight above a city full of people who were taught to see only a symbol. The antenna is gone. But the question it raises is still in the air, waiting, like a signal nobody is listening for someone to finally tune in.